This morning's exhortation, encouragement, will be provided by our brother Casey King, and his title is 153. In preparation for his remarks, he's asked that we read John chapter 21, verses 5 through 11. It's John chapter 21, verses 5 through 11. Then Jesus saith unto them, Children, have ye any meat? They answered him, No. And he said unto them, Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved saith unto Peter, It is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he girt his fisher's coat unto him, for he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in a little ship, for they were not far from land, but as it were 200 cubits, dragging the net with fishes. As soon as they were come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid thereon, and bread. And Jesus said unto them, Bring of the fish which ye have now caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153. And for all there were so many, yet it was not the net broken. Let's now give our full attention to our brother Casey King and his subject again, 153.
This thing on? Huh? Okay. Martha and I are glad to be with you folks this morning. It's always good to come over here and visit with our brothers and sisters, bring you the greetings from the Hall Ecclesia, and we hope we have something to say that's worthwhile this morning. I'd like for you to turn, first of all, to Hebrews, the 7th chapter. Read the first two verses. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. The writer of Hebrews is telling us a whole lot here in these first two verses. We're not going to deal with much of it, but there's one thing that he's bringing out here in these first two verses that I think that we want to appreciate and need to appreciate. And it's something that maybe you have not thought of, and also something more particular that I've not thought of until relatively recently. When we read the first two verses of Hebrews there, the first thing to do is to launch off into some consideration of what the name Melchizedek means, because that's what he does in the second verse. And we're not going to do that this morning. Not going to do anything with Melchizedek today. But I want to point out to you that there's a very important let's call it, exegetical idea coming out right here. And that is that when it is appropriate, or a better way of saying it is that oftentimes it is appropriate to derive some teaching or meaning from the names of individuals. Everybody knows that. We all do it when we do our studies. We think of the names of individuals and what they can tell us. Here we have scriptural warrant for doing that type of analysis and that type of exegesis. Now, I'm not saying that every name of everybody in the Bible will provide that type of teaching for us. Probably on the majority of occasions, it does not. I don't think it's necessary to go through the first few chapters of Chronicles and try to do something with every name that's in there, like the writer of Hebrews does here with Melchizedek, but nevertheless, there is a warrant for doing that. Okay? Scriptural warrant for doing it. I'd like for you to turn over to Galatians, the 3rd chapter. Read another very familiar verse, one that we all learn in Sunday school, Galatians, the 3rd chapter, the 16th verse. Most of you can probably quote this verse once I get it started for you. That's what I would need if the roles were reversed here. I would need somebody to start the verse for me. I wouldn't remember 3:16 precisely. Now, to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. Now, the natural thing to do here, and what we always do when we're looking at this particular passage in Galatians, and it's well that we do that, is to see in this verse, and indeed in the entire letter of Galatians, particularly the 3rd chapter, to see the idea of Christ being the seed of Abraham. And if you go further in the chapter, you see where Paul says, the chapter that we learn and often read on the occasion of an individual's baptism, how one becomes related to Christ and consequently the seed of Abraham. Again, my point here in citing this verse is not to go into any of that. We're not going to talk this morning about Christ being the seed of Abraham, except perhaps by implication. The point here that I'd like to make this morning in the 16th verse, that you have scriptural warrant for looking at numbers. Notice what Paul said. Paul makes a point of this, that I'm going to emphasize. When he read the particular, and there's 2 or 3 passages in Genesis that you could cite that he might be quoting here, Paul came to realize that passage in Genesis, say Genesis the 13th chapter, And I'm looking at my notes here. Let me see. It's hard for me sometimes to read my writing. Genesis 13:15. When it talks about seed, it dawned on Paul that that is singular, not plural, right there. And that the message that he realized and that he is conveying to the Galatians and to us as readers of his letter is that that is a particular point there, that the emphasis should be on a singular rather than a plural seed. Now, I cite this to say, as we did with Melchizedek, is that what you have here is a scriptural warrant for looking at the significance of numbers. Like with Melchizedek, you have the warrant for looking at the significance of names. Here in Galatians 3, you have the idea that considering numbers is important. In this case, in Galatians 3:16, one rather than more than one. And that's important. The natural reading of the passages, say Galatians 13:15, and the others, let me see, 17th chapter of Genesis, and also the 22nd chapter of Genesis, the natural reading of those passages, I think, would be not to see in those passages where it talks about the seed, a singular seed versus a multitudinous seed. In fact, I'm reasonably confident that the Jewish people did not make that distinction. That what Paul tells us here in Galatians, his point between one versus more than one, is something that the Jewish people did not understand. Okay, you can think about that, conjure on it, and see whether you agree. What I'm saying is, and simply my point right now, is that you have, again, I'll use the term warrant, scriptural warrant, for considering the significance of numbers. There, just like you have scriptural warrant for considering the significance of names. Martha and I were talking about this last night, and I was thinking, you know, if we do the exhortation that we decided to do, and I will say this, that my bride is as much a, she formulates these exhortations as much as I do. They're all good and wonderful, don't you know? Well, that's her part in things. Anything that's a problem is what I'm doing. So we're going to look this morning at the significance of numbers, or a number. You know what it is. You just read it in John. You can flip back to John, 21st chapter. Now, this intro, just to say to somebody that I think we have warrant for looking at particular numbers. Again, it doesn't mean that every time you run across a number in Scripture, probably the majority of times, you don't have that, but it is worth thinking about to see what type of message you can get out of it. Okay, We will go back to John 21, and you know the verse 11. This is often cited, and there have been many exhortations and considerations of what it means here. Verse 11, Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153, and for all there were so many, yet was not the net broken. What's the first unusual thing or curious thing about this verse that may strike you, strikes me as curious? What is the point of counting the fishes? If you had been one of these fishermen, I can't believe that they did this routinely. They may have, because there may have been some aspect of marketing, that is selling the fish, that relied upon the number that they caught, but I would more likely think it relied on the weight of the fish that they caught, rather than the number of them. Okay. So why count them? Well, I'm really not sure why, but even that question, I think, is a little early in the discussion. If counting was not so important, who do you think initiated the count? Told them to count the fishes. I expect it was Jesus. It's not said here, so I can't prove that. But my thinking is that he said, count the fishes, and they come up with 153. Okay. I've tried to demonstrate that there is warrant on occasion for looking at numbers. If Jesus is the one that had them count the fishes, then I think there's even more warrant here for doing this. That is, looking for some sort of significance in the number, what type of message we can get. I don't think Jesus is standing around here wasting their time. Count the fish and see if I'm not right, that you caught a whole lot. They knew that already. So let's take a look at it. They fish with nets, dragging the fish to shore. The net was not broken. We'll back up here a little bit. I don't want to turn around. I look at this thing on the screen. So this is just what we've said before. They bring it home. There are a couple of other things that are said, particularly here, associated with the last days of Jesus. A famous verse is the previous chapter in the 31st verse. John tells us something which we know and which we'll use as part of this context. John 20:31, but these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through him. That's another indication that we have to be careful when we do, as I do quite often, and just dismiss something. It's not particularly important. It may be. All right. So we have this load of fishes that is brought in, 153. Okay. Back in Genesis, in the 48th chapter, we have the record of Jacob. By that time, his name is changed to Israel, giving blessing unto the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we read there this statement: let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac. Again, you get this warrant right here of why, that's important. Think of that Hebrews context again with Melchizedek. We derive something from that. In the blessings to Ephraim and Manasseh, it said that the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, should be upon them. And so in that blessing, there is this idea of the name as important. But he goes on to say, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Jacob could have endowed his grandsons with nothing finer. This was the hope of the covenant right here, that he endowed them with, or exhorted, if you will, that the grandsons would maintain, so that they might share in the blessings that the promises contained and still contain for us. That's the point of saying that the name of Abraham and Isaac should be upon them. What is related in the meaning of their names and also in the actions. But that's not all the blessing, and this is what we'll take a look at here. He also says, let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. All right. All right. This is what I've just read to you. We'll do a little concordance work right here. Grow into a multitude, you can see it on the screen, that the Hebrew word translated grow is this word. I presume it's pronounced dega. I don't know if you have an authorized version in front of you right now. But if you do, you may have this marginal rendering for the phrase grow into a multitude, because it's a rather intriguing phrase. It says, instead of just grow into a multitude, the phrase means let them as fishes do increase as a multitude. And so that's an interesting link right there with what we have in John chapter 21. Let's see. And you can see the concordance work up here. It's always related to fish as being part of the multitude. You start with one, you wind up with a multitude, as you see here. Now, the word translated multitude is the Hebrew word rob, R-O-B. The word is consistently used in Scripture about a number that is uncountable. For example, in Genesis 16:10, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly that it shall not be numbered for multitude. That's when God was talking to Hagar about the seed of Ishmael. And a couple of other times it is used. And this is a curious thing. Go back to our fishing vessel. The 153 may be a term that means a multitude too great to be counted. And this is where there's some warrant for the number 153. And we've been through all of that. So look at the last statement up there. I find this fascinating. Ask yourself the question, how many times is the Hebrew word for multitude used in Scripture? You know the answer. You know what's coming, don't you? Used 153 times. You wouldn't know that if you were a first century believer, would you? I find this fascinating too. How would you know that this word is used 153 times? You probably wouldn't know that until this day and age. Why? Because you got this type of technology that you can work with, and you'll search the Old Testament and you can get the number. Otherwise, you wouldn't, nobody would know it. Nobody's going to sit there and count. Go from Genesis through Malachi, or in the Hebrew Scriptures, from Genesis through 2nd Chronicles, and start counting the number of words, the number of times a particular word is used. It's only in this day and age, with this type of technology, that we know this. Now you can think about it and see whether you think there's any significance to it or whether it is just a remarkable coincidence or whether it's a trick that is being played upon us. The point of the 153 in John is not to limit anything, but rather that we have a number that indicates a multitude that is too great to be counted. This is the multitude that will share in the blessings that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It concerns the establishment of God's kingdom on this earth. And those that inhabit the kingdom will be as great as the stars in the heaven or as the sands upon the sea. So, our word this morning is, and this is where we're going to stop, what would be the message of this? If we again assume that Jesus is the one who had them count the fish, and as we recognize that that number, 153, is going to have a nebulous meaning at best to anybody until our day and age. If there's any truth in those ideas, then what lesson do we draw from this? That Jesus is not just teaching his contemporaries, the people that he talked to routinely, Peter and James and John and anybody else that he may have talked to, but he's also talking to you and me. Now, we don't need a sort of cryptic thing. Let's try to interpret what 153 means here. You can chew on this idea and see if you think that that's what it comes out to. More importantly, and my point is that if Jesus is talking to us today, how is he doing it? And what message is he giving to us? Well, let's look at this. Peter, who was on this intimately involved in this episode right here, writes in his second letter that God is not willing that any should perish. To use some of the figures in this episode, he wants us to hold fast to the net that doesn't break. That net is the gospel message, the good news of the covenant promise that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which assured them that if they trusted in him and were faithful with him and to him, he would bring them to that eternal rest that is spoken of in Hebrews, 4th chapter, generally, and that we would be part of a multitude that is too great to be numbered. And I thank you for your attention.